Our next speaker is Doug Peterson. Doug Peterson is best known, probably, for writing something like 48 different VeggieTales books.
42.
42. Oh, I'm sorry.
But who's counting?
2 different VeggieTales books. He's also written several novels and writes other things. Rumor has it he is the person who invented Larry Boy and the Rumor Weed. So I know I'm giving away all kinds of stuff about his talk. I apologize, but you guys are going to love it. It's fun. Anything else I should say about you?
No, that sounds good. All right. Well, thank you, Melody. Thank you for the seminary to invite me to speak today. And this is, or is it going down? Let me see if I can get that to stay. There we go. I think it's going to stay. So I want to talk about my writing life, and oops, I was just saying that it was, oh, there we go. Okay, it was giving some problems before, and then it was working, now it's not. Okay, I've wanted to be a writer since about the 1st grade, and I credit my early passion for writing to a person by the name of James Michael Aloysius Apastapoodle Incaboodle Koketch Mordecai Murphy O'Shea. And that is the name of my grandpa O'Shea. At least that's the name he would give me whenever I would ask him what his name was. He would tell me, my name is James Michael Aloysius Apastapoodle Incaboodle Koketch Mordecai Murphy O'Shea. So, and his real name was James Michael O'Shea. But so, and that's him right there, you know, the picture of a jolly Irishman there. And I remember starting out by writing simple cartoon books. And I'd read them to my grandpa O'Shea because he was an early influencer in my life. Because back then, influencers operated in the old-fashioned way, which was one-on-one, rather than with millions of Instagram followers. So, but I wish that I had the technology we have today to produce my books in grade school, because I would have gone wild with the possibilities. But maybe it was the lack of technology and the technological distractions that pushed me in the directions of books in the first place. So, and that's another picture of my grandpa O'Shea there. That's some of my O'Shea cousins. I'm on the far right and the back with the helmet on. So, but back then, we did not have computers to create your own typeset pages. And Matt talked a lot about AI. We did not have AI, of course. We didn't even have decent photocopy machines when I grew up in the 1960s. It cost 10 cents per page to photocopy at the local library, and the quality was horrible. And that 10 cents per page was way beyond the budget of my budding publishing empire. So whenever I created a book in grade school, I had to handwrite it, staple it together, and come up with a finished product. So I did create what I call a publishing empire of sorts in grade school. The peak was around 4th or 5th grade, and I believe I wrote over 100 books or so. I know I did at least 20 books in one series alone, and that was my Man from Auntie series. Now at the time, oops, went the wrong way. This is giving some trouble. There we go. At the time, the 2 most popular TV spy shows were Mission Impossible and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. So I called my series The Man from Auntie. And I also wrote a bunch of books in a Flintstone series. I based it on the cartoon series. I also had a Stoop, Nagel, and Bud series. I really wanted to use that name as characters in the future, but I learned later on that I got the name from my grandpa O'Shea, and I found out later it was a name from an old radio team from the 1930s, so I can't use Stoop, Nagel, and Bud. But in addition to the series, I also had some standalone books like In Cold Ketchup. That was my take on In Cold Blood. That was a book. I didn't read it at age because it was inappropriate for me, and it was way over my head, but I saw it on on the coffee table. My mom was reading it. So I thought I'd write my own version of In Cold Blood, which was In Cold Ketchup. And what it is, it follows some bumbling detectives, and every time they investigate what appears to be a murder, it turns out the person just spilled ketchup on their shirt, and so it was not a real murder. Now, being a Jules Verne fan, I also wrote my version of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was 20,000 Leagues Under the Swimming Pool. It's about a miniature submarine that winds up in the local public pool. It's actually one I think would be kind of fun to write now. So as you can see, I had a bit of the VeggieTales mindset even from a young age. There's one of my stories, West Slide Story, and then Frog Wars, which is one of the more popular ones. So I start with these stories because it illustrates a key ingredient to becoming a writer or throwing yourself really into any profession for that matter, and it begins with passion and purpose. Those two elements are inseparably linked, and I had the unusual experience of finding my calling at a very young age, finding my purpose. So today I want to begin by tracing the early stages of this passion of mine, and then I'll get into the world of publishing, including self-publishing, because I started my life as a young self-publisher, and that's me on the, I guess it'd be on the left, reading Dennis the Menace with my brother. And I've come full circle because here is me reading my own comic books with my youngest son. And so, but I've come full circle in many different ways. So, and after I cover all those topics on publishing, I'll talk specifically about my latest publishing venture, which is Thrones in the Desert. But first, back to the bio. I loved writing books and reading books as a kid, but I also dabbled in newspapers and magazines even as a kid. And that's why it was I call it a grade school publishing empire. I put out a weekly newspaper. I called it The Weekly Waste. I had 2 subscribers at school, and not having decent photocopy machines, I had to handwrite each of the copies. I also put out a magazine called the Peterson Popper every month, and I passed the copy around. I only made 1 copy of that, and I passed it around the neighborhood. I remember our next door neighbor, Mrs. Carpenter, told me she kept a copy of the Peterson Popper by her bedside Bible. So I knew my purpose, but passion is the fuel that drives you forward in your calling, no matter what your career is. If you don't have passion, it's like a car running low on fuel, and it's so easy to run out of gas. So I had this passion from a very young age. Now, doing this work at a young age also developed in me a high tolerance for monotony. All jobs, no matter how creative, have their monotonous side. And for me, sitting at my desk, like I'm doing right there, writing out 3 copies of the Weekly Waste newspaper was very monotonous, but that didn't stop me because my passion kept moving me forward. It was igniting my interest, kind of like pistons in a car. So recently, I co-wrote a book with a friend called Back to the Futures, and my friend, Scott Irwin, who's an economist, was amazed at the amount of proofing and editing that it required. He was accustomed to writing journal articles. He's published a lot, but this was his first book. And he found the amount of proofing to be both surprising and grueling. It's one thing to proof a 15-page research article. It's another thing to proof a 400-page book again and again and again and again. He said if he had to proof Back to the Futures one more time, he was going to set his hair on fire. But he also said he greatly appreciated the attention to detail. So I've become accustomed to the tedium because I had been exulting in monotony since I was a young kid, to use the phrase of G.K. Chesterton. Now, there's a famous adventurer named Shackleton who led an expedition to the Arctic, but his ship became trapped in ice. The ice exerted tremendous pressure on the ship, and it was threatening to break it to pieces. So every morning, the crew had to get out and chip away at the ice to keep the ship from exploding inward from the pressure. And you'd think that being trapped in ice, having to tirelessly work every single day to chip away at the ice in the cold would have made them either unbearably depressed or angry. But if you read their journals, the men were joyful. Why? I think the men had purpose and passion, and therefore they had joy even in those circumstances. Now, the name of their ship was the Endurance, which is only fitting because purpose and passion enable us to endure. So I endured the monotony of writing and publishing as a kid, but when I reached junior high, I thought I was just too cool for all that. And if you look at this picture of me in junior high, you're wondering, how could this kid be too cool for anything? With my geeky glasses and my skinny frame, I was a not very cool kid trying to be something I wasn't, which was cool. So in junior high, I ditched the writing and I focused on what I thought was a much more realistic career choice, professional baseball. And so this is me in Little League with my dad standing behind me. And it took about 4 years to come to my senses, although 4 years can seem like an eternity at that age. And when I was in junior high school, when I was a junior in high school, not in junior high school, junior in high school, I returned to my passion and I began writing for my school newspaper, and I covered sports for the local paper as well in Lombard, which is a western suburb of Chicago. So at that time I was obsessed with sports, so I set my sights on becoming a sports writer. And when I came to the University of Illinois, after being told that I didn't have the test scores to make it into the U of I did get into U of I and I became a sports writer for the Daily Illini. And so I covered covered cross country among other things. This is when Craig Virgin won the national championship in cross country. So ironically, I would go on to write on many different subjects and genres, but after college, I've really written very little to next to nothing about sports. I'm finally remedying that situation by I'm working on a sports-themed book with my youngest son, a sports-themed book aimed at middle schoolers. So, but up to this point, I've really not done anything on sports. But that brings me to the next tool in my writing survival kit, and that's versatility, or the ability to pivot. And being at Peterson, I got to stick with all the P words here, so it's pivoting. And so I majored in journalism, which is a dying profession today, but it fostered versatility, because journalism, it's a much more formulaic style of writing, but it taught me to write quickly, and it taught me to meet deadlines. And I'd already learned the discipline during grade school, my grade school publishing days, but journalism solidified that quality, because you have to meet deadlines if you want to keep a job. So after school, my wife got her master's degree at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I was editor of a small town newspaper just outside of Madison. But then when she finished her master's, we came back to Champaign. And that's when I stumbled into the ideal writing situation. I became a part-time writer for the University of Illinois. And I began a job which I was told, we've got funding for 1 year and that's it. Well, 30 years later, I was able to retire from this quote-unquote temporary job at the age of 52. But that half-time job allowed me to pursue my greatest writing passions for the other half-time, and I was a half-time freelance writer. So with journalism comes great versatility. I found I could pivot and write in many different genres and for many different ages. Since the late 1970s, I've written newspaper articles, magazine stories, multimedia programs, fact sheets, children's books. Whoa, I just want to buy a couple here to get back. Let's see if I can go backwards here. Well, it's not going backwards. It may not take me back. Oh, well, I was showing you one of my children's books. And so I've written as well as nonfiction books. That was Moose and Men, the nonfiction book example. I've written novels. I've written screenplays, plays, and most recently, comic books. And I've written for every age. I've written from preschool board books to picture books for young children, to Sunday school materials for junior high and high school, to college, and adult readers as well. So versatility and pivoting. So the next factor that's enabled me to survive in a writing life is perhaps the most important, or is the most important, and that's providence. The old cliche is that God has a plan for your life. Well, in my case, it's almost as if God had an outline for my life. Because if I look back at my writing life, I can see pattern in the different kinds of writing that I did, decade by decade. Throughout my career, each decade was dominated by different types of writing. During the 1970s, my focus was newspapers. During the 1980s, my focus was primarily magazines, and some may have ever heard of the Wittenberg Door. Anybody heard? I was a regular contributor to the Wittenberg Door. And here's an example. They always had very creative covers. They always did their issues on different themes. And so this is the editor. The theme on this issue was feminism. So the editor, Mike Iaconelli, let's see if I can read it here, says, as editor of the Door, I have been asked publicly to publicly announce our magazine's wholehearted support for the women's movement and to declare our solidarity with our feminist sisters everywhere. Well, this particular issue had a fold-out on the cover, and that is his wife Carla holding a gun up to his head. So this was kind of the forerunner to the Babylon Bee, the Wittenberg Door. And so this was this satirical magazine. It rose up in California during the late 60s. And some also called it the Mad Magazine of Evangelical Christianity. So then during the 1990s, I turned to books. Now technically my very first book, I Never Promised You a Hot Tub, came out towards the end of the 80s in 1987. But most of my early books were published in the 90s. And that's when I used to like to say that I was a writer of rare books. It didn't always sell very well. Some did. And then during the 2000s, my focus then turned to children's books, most notably VeggieTales. And I'll come back to that story soon. Then in the 2010s, historical novels, where I put most of my energy into. And now in the 2020s, my life has become dominated by writing comic books. But during every stage, I didn't drop the other kinds of writing. I still write feature stories for the U of I, even today. I still write children's books, I still write nonfiction, and I still write historical novels. About the only thing I don't do is write for newspapers. But comic books have taken over because my publishers had me writing. We just put out, I think, I lost track, in the last year and a half, 13 or 14 or 15. Well, some are still in production. But we bound the first 10 into a nice graphic novel. But it's basically covering American history from Mayflower to 9/11. And the first 10 go from Mayflower to the end of the Revolutionary War. So, and I even have a couple copies here if anyone's interested. But I thought I'd add a little side note here about writing a comic book script. It's a little bit like writing a film script. What I do is I provide the art suggestions panel by panel, and I also give them the dialogue. Now I call it the art suggestions because I want to give the artists some freedom, because they are the artists after all, but I also want them to give them an idea of what I'm picturing, especially since they're not historians. So I also do extensive research gathering reference images for most of the images, because again, they're not historians, so I have to look at all these images so they know what the various people look like and what the places look like. So you see at the end of one of these, or like there, I got all these reference images to the Mayflower, what the ship looks like. Now with this series, I've been able to work with a team of amazing artists. Each comic is actually created by a team of artists, and it begins with the penciler. The penciler for virtually all of these comics that I've done have been a Brazilian artist named Joe Bennett, who, before he was doing John Adams and George Washington, he was doing The Incredible Hulk and Spider-Man. So he's a wonderful artist, and and spoke about fast, he's very fast too, but he's the penciler. And here's another example. We always like to every issue have the money page where it's like a 2-page spread, and there's a dramatic sea battle right there, but he's just a beautiful artist. But he's just one part of the team. And he starts with these rough sketches. So here's a rough sketch from the Mayflower. This is page 2 of the Mayflower. And then after we approve it, the editor and myself approve that, he goes to the pencil sketch, which, as you can see, I mean, those alone are, I think, are beautiful works of art. Such detail is amazing. But then he passes on, once we approve that, he passes it on to the inker, who then puts the inks there. And finally, the colorist, who just really makes it come alive, adds special effects as well as the color. So, so that is, again, it's a team. Oh, and last but not least, I don't want to forget, the last one is the letterer, who then adds the words, the narration and the dialogue. So actually 4 artists are involved with every comic book. So, but anyhow, that's a tangent. I'm going to go back to Providence in the late 1990s, and that's when I made my connection with VeggieTales. Well, to explain how that happened, I need to go back to my very first published magazine story called The Career of Orville Sash. It was published by Sojourners magazine in 1978, if anyone's familiar with that magazine. And I thought I'd take a little time, it's a very short story, so I thought I could read it to you. Because this became the key to becoming a writer for VeggieTales, was this story. And it's a story, like I said, in 1978. It's a short little fairy tale. So this is the career of Orville Sash. Once upon a time, in a city by the sea, there stood a skyscraper spearing the clouds like a beanstalk. The company that monopolized the structure was Grinded & Company, its specialty, bug spray. Orville Sash worked in the lowest reaches of the building. He was a minimum wage worker, a mailroom clerk. There came a day when Orville found a roach scurrying across the floor. As mailroom clerk, Orville had only bugs to command and bully. He raised his foot to flatten the helpless speck. Spare me. The bug spoke. A speaking bug, such a creature is worth millions. Visions of money cascaded through Horville's mind, splashing like a green, crisp waterfall of Washington-faced paper. Horville spared the bug. His reward? A wish. I wish to be promoted to the second floor. Granted. Horville's boss told him that very day. Horville marched into the second floor like MacArthur and Patton rolled into one. His efficiency apartment gave way to a 3-bedroom townhouse. Wait. Horville heard footsteps on the ceiling of floor number 2. There was a 3rd floor. A higher level meant higher wages. Splashing, splashing, the visions of monetary waterfalls returned. Back to the bug. Another wish? Are you sure? Asked the roach. I'm sure. The next day, Horville rose to the 3rd floor post of sales coordinator. Goodbye, townhouse. Hello, cottage by the lake. No use. The promotions were kerosene to a flame. Desire grew, burned. Horville wanted the 10th floor. He wanted to swim among the green paper portraits of presidents. One more wish. It was done. Horville entered his 10th floor position like a sultan on the back of an elephant. Personal secretary, spacious office, his title, executive of sales. His new home in the suburbs gleamed like a sword. He had cut his way to the top. But no, can't be. Shufflings on the ceiling, more shoes, more people above his head, higher, more rungs to the ladder, more power, more money. Back to the bug. Under threat of death, the roach granted another wish. President of sales. Horville's new office outsized his old apartment. His secretaries numbered 3. Pack your bags, wife, we're moving to Holt Estates. These were big homes, lounging like lions at the edge of suburbia. On the elevator, Horville saw it. More numbers, more floors, more desire. Climb, climb that waterfall. The roach was summoned, another threat. What could the bug do? Another wish, another home, another office. Tragedy. A memo appeared on Horville's desk, as mysterious as a mushroom. It came from the Executive Almighty. That meant Horville wasn't on top yet. Climb, climb. Again, the roach was called before the Sultan. Another wish or I squash you with my penny loafers. What could the bug do? As the Chief Executive Almighty, Horville's domain covered 6 floors, 94 to 99. 25 secretaries, all his, filed into his palace like 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. cattle. At night, their stalls were cleaned. Horville sat by the indoor pool on floor 96. The artificial wave system went out of control and tiny tidal waves raced from one end of the pool to the other. Banks of water met head-on like charging battalions. The walls echoed with the sound of splashes. The Sultan laughed in the dark. The next day, Horville discovered it by chance. A stairway leading up. Another floor. He scrambled up the stairs. He was on the roof, his concrete eyrie. Below, the city looked like a toy, a Monopoly game. Below, people were just plastic pieces to be moved about or swept off the table. He was the highest. Content, Horville headed for the stairway down. What's this? A boy by the edge of the building with his eyes closed. What are you doing? Praying. To whom? Horville's wish, to Horville. But it wasn't so. The boy's answer? To God. Who? Horville had left his theology book in the mailroom. The boy pointed a finger skyward. God. Panic gripped Horville. Was there a floor above him? He couldn't see it, just clouds. He couldn't hear the shuffling of feet. Do you mean there's an authority above me? Yes. The roach was summoned. Roach, make me God. Make me the highest. Are you sure? He was. Put me in the type of position that only God would hold if he were on earth. The very next day, Horville began work in the mailroom. Thank you. Let me put this away here. So this story about a magical cockroach, whoops, and I went back there again, about a magical cockroach was purchased by United Methodist Communications in the 1980s. And their idea was to turn it into a short animated film. But when United Methodist Communications, they tried to start their own TV network, and it ended in disaster, and they hemorrhaged money. They scrapped the animated movie idea. So imagine my surprise when I learned that they went ahead and adapted the story as a music video featuring Grammy winner Jennifer Warren, so you see there. And it was a very kind of an odd video with the way they were trying to do it. But anyhow, it was turned into a music video. When VeggieTales was hitting its peak in the 1990s, I thought, okay, maybe they would be interested in actually turning this story into an animated film. It wasn't a VeggieTales story, I knew that, but I thought maybe with their success they might want to branch out into other forms of animation. So I sent the story to them blindly, which goes to show you never know what's going to happen if you don't take chances. So a few weeks later, on a Sunday night, I received a call from Bob the Tomato, and it was actually Phil Vischer, who was a co-founder of VeggieTales and the voice of Bob the Tomato, and he loved the story. But because it wasn't a VeggieTales story, he wasn't interested in making it into an animated film. But the story earned me an invitation to become part of a team of freelancers to pitch ideas for their next Larry Boy video. So I sent him an idea every day for almost 2 weeks, and there are other freelancers doing the same thing. Evidently, I could have quit after the first day, because the very first story idea I sent to him became Larry Boy and the Rumor Weed. And this was actually the very first story that came from outside the company. And ironically, if I had sent my story, The Career of Orville Sash, to him 1 year later, Phil Vischer would never have been allowed to see it, because the lawyers would have prevented it. Because lawyers don't like creatives opening unsolicited manuscripts, just on the outside chance that whatever idea is being sent to them could be similar to what they're already working on, and it would be an invitation to a lawsuit. But fortunately, he did open the envelope, and I got my foot in the door. It was Providence. But I didn't, even with that, I didn't get much more than a foot in the door, because I soon followed up. I went and sent them some picture book ideas, and even with my connection, those stories wound up in what's called the editor's slush pile, a towering stack of unread manuscripts. But again, Providence stepped in, God stepped in. The editor was having a bad day one afternoon, so she decided to dig into her slush pile to see what was there, and she found my story, The Slob Father. And she loved it. It became the first of 42 books, and the first of, I think, 7 in the series, the Mess Detective series, which is kind of a spoof on the old Dragnet series, for anyone old enough to remember that. So anyhow, in keeping with my P-word theme, the greatest key to survival is providence and prayer. And I typically don't like to say that God told me to write this or that, because I'm hesitant to connect God with my very flawed skills. I'm always afraid people are going to say, if God told you to write that, wouldn't it be a lot better? But despite that fear, I've seen the hand of God active throughout my life, and that includes my writing life. My other clear leading from God came when I made a transition from writing for VeggieTales to writing historical novels. I really think it was a God thing when VeggieTales invited me to a screening of their movie, The Pirates Who Don't Do Anything. I was supposed to go to Chicago, but they made a mistake and sent me and my wife to Cincinnati. Well, while we were in Cincinnati, Nancy, my wife, and I had an afternoon to kill, so we wandered over to the Underground Railroad Museum. And we almost didn't go in because my wife thought it would be just too upsetting to go into a museum dealing with something that's gut-wrenching as slavery. But I'm really happy we did enter, because at this museum, we came across a small exhibit about Henry Box Brown. He's a slave who escaped by shipping himself in a box from Richmond to Philadelphia. It's an incredible true story. Now, independent of each other, both Nancy and I had a sense that I should turn this story into a book, and sure enough, it became my first historical novel, The Disappearing Man. And not only that, about a month after that screening in Cincinnati, when we went to the museum, VeggieTales told me they were putting a hold on any new children's books, because they had already glutted the market. I did 42 alone, so there's a lot of books out there. They wanted to put a hold on it. So the timing was providential. I think it was meant to be for me to move into an entirely new venture in publishing. Which then brings me to the next P word, and that's publishing. So much has changed since I published my first book, I Never Promised You a Hot Tub. I wrote that book for Zondervan Publishers, one of the largest Christian publishers. I still think they are. And I was able to do it without an agent. Now today, most publishers will not look at you if you do not have an agent. In the 1980s, Zondervan had a large team of salespeople. They covered bookstores across the country. Amazon didn't exist, of course. So it was all about boots on the ground, selling books bookstore by bookstore. So today, bookstores are vanishing and almost extinct. But when I started, Champaign-Urbana, I think had 2 or 3 Christian bookstores alone. And it didn't count 6 or 7 mainline bookstores and maybe 2 or 3 used bookstores. So today there's 2 enormous hurdles for writers instead of 1. First, you got to find an agent in most cases, and that's a lot of work in itself. And then your agent has to find a publisher, and that's not easy. Now, this may sound dismal and discouraging for writers, but there is hope, because I heard a speaker one time say this, and I completely agree. Today is perhaps the best time in the history of the world to be a writer, and that's because of self-publishing. And this was my first self-published novel, was the Harriet Tubman novel. I had found that they didn't do, no one had ever done a novel about Harriet Tubman, and so I decided I'd followed up and do complete my Underground Railroad series with her. They'd done lots and lots of nonfiction and lots of kids' books, but no one had done a novel about her. So, but anyhow, back in the 1980s, self-publishing was looked down upon, and that's because there was really no way for a self-published writer to promote his or her book. You could count on selling, copies to your very tolerant friends and family, but that was very difficult. Beyond that, it's very difficult and expensive to sell your book. Today, the landscape has changed, and although my first 4 novels were with a traditional publisher, my last 3 have been self-published, and I'm loving the process. Now, my publisher, he stopped doing traditional novels and decided to focus just on comic books. And then my agent also turned it to other things. So I was left at that time with a double whammy. I had to find a new agent and a new publisher. And as you can tell by my gray hair, I'm getting up there in age, and I decided I don't want to bother with all that. So that's why I thought I'm going to try self-publishing. And now the biggest stumbling block, of course, has always been promotion, because self-published books rarely get into bookstores. But with Amazon, that's changed. Selling ebooks is possible if you're willing to spend some money on advertising. I self-published my last 3 novels, and I found I was able to sell a lot more total books than my publisher was, and a lot more ebooks than my publisher ever did. So I made an agreement with my publisher. I said, can I re-release my other novels with him as ebooks, and I would promote them myself, and I would do the ebooks and he would do the print books, and he agreed to that. I had another novel called The Vanishing Woman, and it was languishing. It only had, with my traditional publisher, it had only 18 reviews on Amazon. And since I've been promoting it on Amazon, it's now up to about 900 ratings and reviews through Amazon. And I've sold a lot more copies than he ever did. So now the big question, I'm selling copies, but am I making money? And the answer to that is easy, not a lot. And that leads me to an important point. Unless you are James Patterson or J.K. Rowling, some other bestseller, don't expect to get rich from writing. So it really needs to be a calling. It's not going to be a money-making scheme. But I'd always had a steady but modest income from my other forms of writing, so I haven't had pressure to make any money on my self-publishing. So my goal is just to try to get as close to breaking even as I can and sell as many books as I can. And that so far has been working. So that brings me to my latest novel, Thrones in the Desert. And to trace the inspiration for this novel, I go back to Ben-Hur, the Academy Award-winning movie from 1959. And of course, I had to do a VeggieTales version of it called Ben-Hurry. It's all about patience, teaching kids patience. But Ben-Hur had a big impact on me spiritually, because I never forgot the scene where Jesus is offering water to a very thirsty Ben-Hur, who was a Roman prisoner. And I also I never forgot the bloody scene when Ben-Hur's rival is crushed beneath the wheels in a chariot race. But what struck me about Ben-Hur was the fresh eyes it brought to the gospel story. The movie wasn't about Jesus overtly. The story was about a fictional character, Ben-Hur, but the Messiah haunted every frame of that movie. And that has stuck with me. So when I decided to write my first biblical history novel, I decided to center it around not one fictional character, but 5. I sometimes call it the Game of Thrones meets the book of Luke. Because for those familiar with the Game of Thrones novels, they follow like a dozen or more characters throughout a fantasy world. I decided to follow a more manageable 5 characters. And that is a slave woman, a bodyguard in Herod's palace, the daughter of a zealot, a tax collector, and a Pharisee. And like Ben-Hur, Jesus is not the main character, but he's behind every scene because the 5 characters' lives intertwine within the Gospel of Luke. Now, one unique feature of this novel is the structure. Thrones in the Desert has 12 chapters. Each chapter directly corresponds with the first 12 chapters of the book of Luke. And every chapter contains at least something that can be found in the corresponding chapter from Luke. Not everything is covered, but something is. So as you're reading the novel, you're moving through Luke chapter by chapter. It's a way you can study the book of Luke. Now, the second book in the series, which I hope to come out by the end of this year, is Swords in the Desert. It's going to follow the same characters through the last 12 chapters of Luke. And if I want to continue the series, I've already begun developing ideas for Fire in the Desert, which would follow the first half of Luke's companion book, Acts. And along the way, not every character will survive, but I'll always keep 5 characters that I'm following, but not all of them will survive. So my other inspiration for Thrones in the Desert, besides Ben-Hur, was my pastor, Seth Curlin, who bears very little resemblance to Charlton Heston. And as far as I know, he has never been a galley slave in a Roman ship. But he did have some amazing adventures while sailing around the world with his mother while he was in high school, so he may share a little bit more in common with Ben-Hur than I thought. But Seth was doing a sermon series on the book of Luke for about a year, and it inspired me to select that gospel. And as I then learned, Luke had the eye of a historian, so he was the ideal choice for someone who had been writing historical novels for the past 10 years. So by choosing to view the story through the eyes of 5 fictional characters, I also avoided something I didn't feel very comfortable doing. I didn't want to fictionalize the gospel, let alone Jesus. Now, I should say that whenever I write a historical novel like The Disappearing Man, my aim is to be as faithful to the history as possible. But it's inevitable that I'm going to have to create fictional scenes, and within these scenes, I got a fictional dialogue. But they're still based on reality. Now, as an example, for The Disappearing Man, it was based on 2 slave narratives, one written in 1849 and the other in 1851. And these narratives give me a wealth of details about his story, amazing story. But they left out a key element, and that's Henry Brown's relationship with his wife, Nancy, who just happened to be the same name as my wife's name, which helped me to connect with him. And their relationship really was the emotional core of the story, so I figured I have to create some fictional scenes recounting how they met, how Henry courted her within the slave system, and how they came to be married. None of these details are in the narrative, slave narrative, so I created them out of thin air. Now, when writing historical novels, one golden rule I try to follow is I may add to the history by creating these scenes, but I do not change the history. And I followed this rule faithfully, except in one case. My first novel, The Disappearing Man, my editor and publisher both said I had to change one pretty important element of Henry's history, and I would tell you what it was, but that would be a major spoiler. But other than that, I've stuck to that rule. I only add to the story, but I don't change the history. And novels and films, as you know, they continually alter history, and I'm just not comfortable doing that with real-life characters. And so that brings me to the question, fictionalizing the Bible. I can't say I'm opposed to it. I'm just saying it was out of my comfort zone to put words into Jesus' mouth. Now, I assume a lot of you have seen The Chosen. How many people have seen The Chosen? Yeah, most of you have, which I think is just a wonderful series. But obviously the series does just that. It fictionalizes the disciples, creates new scenes, creates fresh dialogue, and it's been incredibly effective, and I applaud that ability to bring Jesus to people in a fresh way. Again, looking for a fresh way to present the gospel. It's having a tremendous impact for good. So I'm not judging their creative choices. I can't complain about a story that is bringing the gospel alive to millions of people, but it's an approach I just didn't feel equipped to follow. So in Thrones in the Desert, all the words of Jesus come directly from the pages of Luke. And although I create a little bit of fictional dialogue for people such as Mary, very little, most of the dialogue spoken by the other biblical characters also comes from Luke. And of course, having fictional characters allows me the freedom to do that, because I'm just really focusing on their stories. And I realize I'm still fictionalizing the gospel to some extent by creating a scene. You're fictionalizing it. I'm trying to get the reader to picture what it must have been like to hear Jesus speak the Sermon on the Mount. So I can't take issue with those who go farther than I did, creating entirely new subplots for the various biblical characters. So before I end, I wanted to give credit to the Urbana Theological Seminary, but not just for inviting me to give this talk, because without UTS classes, I don't think I could have written a novel. I know I couldn't have written a novel, The Thrones in the Desert, without classes like the Old and New Testament taught by Ked and Cuffy, as well as many other classes. I think and I'm serious about this, I think I've learned more about the Bible in the last 8 years than I learned in my first 60 years of life. So I encourage you to take classes. Now, the seminary also, they had a trip to Israel. And whenever I write a historical novel, I always make a point of visiting the location of the story. And UTS made that possible through its Israel trip. And that is not a doctored photo. That is what the sky looked like. That's our group at the Sea of Galilee doing a baptism. It was just an amazing sky. So let me end where I began. As a boy, I loved to write and publish my own stories through Peterson Publications, which is the name I gave my publishing empire. As a 68-year-old, I've returned to self-publishing. I now have the tools to create my own books, and I'm having the time of my life. I'm recapturing my childhood, which maybe I never really left if you look at my VeggieTales writing. But if you're interested in learning more about self-publishing and promoting self-published works, may have a little bit of time for Q&A afterwards. But suffice it to say that self-publishing can work, and it's now gained a measure of respectability if you do it correctly. Some best-selling authors do both. They publish through traditional outlets, and they self-publish on the side. I still write for traditional publishers, but I have no plans on taking my novels to a traditional publisher unless they come to me and have a big offer, some great offer. But I'm having too much fun. And that brings me to my final key to surviving the writing life, and that's my final P, playfulness. I started out my life writing books as soon as I learned the alphabet at St. Alexander's Grade School, and I plan to write as long as my brain keeps functioning, or I'm replaced by an AI, as we were in our previous talk. But this playfulness is what makes writing a joy, even when I face the more monotonous chores, such as proofing and editing. I don't think anyone ever captured the playfulness of childhood better than G.K. Chesterton did in his classic work, Orthodoxy. So he said, because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, do it again, and a grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun, and every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never got tired of making them. It may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. So every morning, I hope to say, do it again, as I sit down to write, and every day I plan to exult in monotony, because every day I seek to create, for as J.R.R. Tolkien said, we create because we were created in the image of a creator. Thank you.